Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and changemakers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our documentary series, From Bankruptcy to Reinvention, the City of Stockton, California. The documentary series attempts to provide listeners with the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the various voices of changemakers working to reinvent the city of Stockton. The interviews were conducted from August to September 2016, leading up to the election of Mayor Michael Tubbs, who is our central character in the series. The interviews in the documentary series have been edited to fit into our show format. The unedited full interviews will be posted on my website, georgekoster.com, along with each episode of the series.
So that's one of the things I started to understand in the youth ministry, this idea of empowerment of our young people, that they really have the ability to do what they want and move mountains in many different ways, is, I think, how we're going to bring about change.
Segregated to a 4-block area, Little Manila, located in downtown Stockton, was home to the largest community of Filipinos outside of the Philippines. In this episode, we feature the voice of Dillon Delvo, a second-generation Filipino American and co-founder of Little Manila Rising. Dillon and fellow co-founder, the late Dr. Don Mabalon, formed Little Manila Rising to both preserve the history and reclaim the last remaining buildings of Little Manila. Dillon shares his passion, insights, and organizational work around advocacy, education, arts, and culture is part of Little Manila Rising's efforts to revitalize the Filipino American community in Stockton. The Filipino American community is the largest Asian community in California.
Well, my name is Dillon Delvo, and Little Manila kind of came about just from really just, I think, fate. I'm now the executive director of Little Manila. Been doing this now for 3 years, although we've been operating as an organization as volunteers for the past 16 years. It all starts with myself and my friend, Dr. Don Mabalon, who's now a professor of history at San Francisco State University. We've known each other ever since middle school, me in 7th grade and her in 8th grade, and then throughout high school. And then we went off to college, so we were friends. She went off to UCLA. I went to San Francisco State. And what we both learned, kind of when we come back into town, although, we didn't really stay in contact too much, but at our annual Barrio Fiesta, which is kind of the biggest Filipino gathering in Stockton annually, we saw each other again, and we reconnected. And the thing that really we started talking about, it was the fact that although we were born and raised in Stockton, our dads were both guys from the Manong generation, which is the first large generation of Filipinos to come to America, mostly in the 1920s, as a result of California agriculture, the industry starting to kind of explode. They needed cheap labor at the time. The Philippines was a territory of the United States, and so they could come over as naturals. So the big thing to us is, although Stockton is kind of the center of California ag, and they were migrant field workers, and all this history took place in Stockton. And as a matter of fact, it was the largest population of Filipinos in the world outside of the Philippines at the time, from the 1920s to about the early 1960s. We knew nothing about our history, which also meant we knew nothing about our dads to a certain degree. And we didn't know anything about this heritage that really kind of helps to define our identities. We didn't know about ourselves, and we were kind of on the cusp of losing all this history, which we, through college, ethnic studies classes, was so much of our inspiration. Understanding for the first time that success is not so much this kind of thing that you do by yourself, but it's really about building upon a legacy of people that sacrificed greatly for you to have the opportunities that you have today. Not acknowledging that, not letting it be kind of a way to live your life is, I think, what privilege is. So for us to learn that, it was really life-changing for us. And here we were learning about all this stuff, the history of Stockton. We were born and raised there, but I had to go to San Francisco and she had to go to LA to learn it. And we kept on, the question of why did we have to leave Stockton to learn about Stockton is something that really kind of messed with our minds. So at that festival, Dawn started talking about working on her doctorate in history. And her project was going to be on Little Manila, this place in downtown Stockton, which is adjacent and kind of mixed into Chinatown at the time. Filipinos and many people of color from in the 1920s and 1930s weren't allowed north of Main Street. It wasn't a law, but we heard stories that police didn't have a problem taking people back to where they belonged at the time. And so we're actually on Main Street right now. And as we're coming back into town, she said, well, we got to do something about this because there's only a few buildings left. Most of it was destroyed by the Crosstown Freeway. And literally there's a wrecking ball in front of one of the last remaining blocks. At the time, the city was calling it the Gateway Project because it's the first thing that you see when you come off the freeway and coming into downtown Stockton. And their vision of a gateway project welcoming people to Stockton was to build a McDonald's and Union 76 station. It was personal to Dawn because that block housed her grandfather's restaurant and the Lafayette lunch counter. And at that time, no one really understood the history of that area or valued that history. It was really seen as kind of just, well, that's Skid Row. That's where all the bums hang out, all the homeless hang out. But not understanding the context of stuff like redlining, stuff like the fact that, people weren't welcome on a certain side of town. And, the fact that it became kind of more of a class issue rather than a race issue, basically the current day class lines were drawn by yesterday's racial lines. And that's, I guess you can debate on whether, there's still class lines or racial lines. But basically, we stood in front of these buildings, and I was a film major, and so I videotaped the destruction of these buildings. And, while Dawn was working on her dissertation about these buildings. And so she went and did exhaustive research on the history of every single building and what it was been throughout time, and really painting a picture of this community that existed of what really Little Manila was.
And it was called Little Manila.
Yeah, it was called Little Manila. It was the largest population of Filipinos in the world, outside the Philippines in the 1920s, 1960s. And one of the biggest reasons why that was Little Manila is because there were actual Filipino businesses there, which is rare back in those days, because it was illegal for Filipinos to own property. But there were folks that were willing to lease property to them, and so that's how they were able to have businesses there. Now, the Filipino immigrants at the time were field workers, so they're migrant field workers. So they were actually only in town. Most of them were in town just for like December until around April, May, for asparagus season, and then they would go, Delano, and all the way up to Alaska for canning season. But why Stockton? It was because of these businesses that were there. What Dawn has found is that in many of the letters, she's found it, like, if you couldn't own property and your only form of communication, right, there wasn't really like international calling back then. Obviously, there's no Facebook or texting or, IMing or any of that stuff. And you're a 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old person coming to a strange land. Your only form of communication was mail. Oftentimes, it was these businesses that would hold all these shoe boxes of mail, and you would use their addresses so that when you would come in for asparagus season, it was the only opportunity you can hear from your family and catch up and see what's going on. And I think, more than anything, I think that's why a migrant field laborer could consider that place home, right? It's the only way to connect. So those businesses were essential in that community just to be able to communicate. So what happens next? Dawn started saying, "Hey, we can't save these buildings. It's already too late for us, but we could at least mark them." And so her and I worked towards, with the city, to have the city name at a historic site. We got a lot of support from the vice mayor at the time. Her name was Gloria Namora, who was, I think, one of the first Filipino politicians to get at the vice mayor level. And so we were able to get that done. We raised money. It's funny how we raised funds because literally we were just out of college. So kind of at the same time when we were trying to figure out how we were going to pay back our student loans, we decided, hey, let's mark this area. And so one of the ways we raised funds was we had a friend that designed a T-shirt for us, and we literally sell these T-shirts out of the trunks of our car. And then another thing that happened was like Dawn was parked. It's a funny story. She was parked over a manhole in San Francisco, and there was an underground explosion, and her car was actually lifted up because of this explosion. And so anyway, part of the settlement from that helped pay for these banners. And so literally it was extremely grassroots. And I will say that at the time, we were all extremely innocent about what was going on in the city. So the year at this point is probably around 2000 when we kind of get started. Like 1999 when Dawn and I start talking, and then 2000 when we really get started in designating the place. And then in 2002, it gets designated. We've raised the money. We're putting up banners. And then we unveil October 2002. We were able to shut down one of the streets, and we had about 700 people show up and had this great kind of just unveiling ceremony. All the politicians are there. And we get to show that plaque, well, not really plaque, but the sign that you see when you come off the freeway. And all the banners that kind of tell the story of Little Manila. There's different themes as you look at all the banners. And so that happens. And then another thing happens. So all of a sudden, the person that we asked, the vice mayor at the time, that we asked to be our chairperson, the organization, quits on us, which we didn't really understand. And I think she was just, I'm just overwhelmed. A lot of things going on. And so I think you and Dawn can do a great job, right? About a month after the unveiling, we find out that the city has named that block that we were on as one of the blocks in an 8-square block redevelopment area. It's been named a redevelopment area. For over a year, there was a developer working on a plan to build a strip mall in the area that we had just designated as historic. And so what kind of came out to be, it was like, we just wanted to mark the area so people would know that this is significant, not just to local history, but really Filipino American history, which in the end is really just American history, to all of a sudden, how do we save 3 buildings, right? And that question of how do we save 3 buildings is something that we're still trying to answer today. And what we've learned, I think, over the past 16 years is that it's not as easy as just buying the buildings.
Were you able to actually purchase the buildings?
Well, at one point we did. We entered in an LLC with another organization, but then lost it with the whole market crash.
Right.
But anyway, prior to that, what happened was the RFP from the city went out for this development plan. There was already a developer who had worked on it for over a year. The developer at the time, current city council member of Union City, ex-mayor of Union City, and our city manager at the time, a guy named Mark Lewis. His job prior to being the city manager of Stockton was being the city manager of Union City. And so how does one find out about this redevelopment plan a year ahead before it gets announced? It's all kind of inside. And I think their thought at the time is that, I know their whole thing was, if we can develop and increase the tax base, then we can do a bunch of good stuff. But of course, at the time, Stockton was one of the fastest growing cities in America. Basically, city government gave the keys to developers, massive sprawl throughout the city. All this stuff really leads to the bankruptcy of Stockton, a fiscal bankruptcy, but on our side, we also believe a moral bankruptcy as we start to engage. And kind of these 2 newly graduated students just say, let's fight developers. We were extremely naive. Now, if you would have asked present day 43-year-old Dillion, right? Hey, can we fight developers? I'd be like, hell no, and this is crazy. But I think our advantage at the time is that we were extremely naive, and we were like, wow, we were born and raised in Stockton, went to SUSC schools, lived in Southside our whole lives, and went off to college, and now we're coming back, and we want to help, right? And we thought, the city people are going to love us, and who does that? At the time in 2000, no one does that. Everyone was always leaving Stockton, so there was never a lack of smart and talented people in Stockton. It was just, how do you get them back, right? They would fall in love with the communities where they went to school, or job opportunities, that were prevalent in other places, just weren't available in Stockton at the time.
Which gets us into that whole conversation we were just having a second ago of Michael Tubbs' generation, your generation working together, and that, if you will, kind of in-migration of Stockton residents coming back to work in the community. But I want to go back to your point about moral bankruptcy. Being a native Stockton myself and watching it over many decades, could you please share a little bit more about what your and Don's take on the moral bankruptcy of the leadership of Stockton, for example?
Sure. So the question of how do you save through buildings, right? And so there was a one month time frame for the request for proposals for a development plan, and we approached the city and we asked, can you delay it 3 months? Because although I was a film major at San Francisco State and Don was a history major, we believed that we could, in 3 months, come up with a development plan, though neither one of us are affluent. So the crazy thing is we did come up with a development plan.
You're listening to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. This is George Coster, your host, and if you're just joining us, in this episode, we are discussing the reinvention of the city of Stockton, California. Our guest today is Dillon Delvo, the co-founder and executive director of Little Manila Rising. Dillon is reviewing both his and fellow co-founder, the late Dr. Don Mabalon's, long-term efforts to negotiate with the city of Stockton and real estate developers over the historical Little Manila buildings, as well as build a grassroots community movement to preserve and revitalize what is left of the Little Manila legacy.
So how did we get there? Well, we called our friends that we knew in college, and they were involved in urban planning. One was Michelle Mabalon, who's now the head of the Asian Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. Another person, her name's April Veneracion. She has been extremely active in San Francisco and now works for Supervisor Jane Kim. But at that time, we were just newly graduated. And we together kind of started figuring out, okay, we need to hold 3 community charrettes. And so we knocked on all the doors in the community, in an 8 square block. So of the development plan, there was only 3 buildings that we were concerned with on one of the blocks, but you're talking about 8 square block area. So it quickly became more than just a Filipino American preservation issue. As we knocked on doors and talked to residents, business owners, nonprofits that were in the area, what we found were community members, Stocktonians, who were always under the threat of eminent domain. One family had lived there. They were in their 3rd generation in that house. Their grandparents had lived in that house. They were born and raised in that house. And they said, wow, this is the first time anyone asked us what we'd like to see in our community. All we would hear from the city is we would always just get these letters that eminent domain was coming. And at the time, eminent domain, I mean, in 2000, 2001, housing prices were soaring. The property value in that area was probably the lowest in Stockton at the time. And so you do eminent domain on these families, you were making homeowners, right, into renters overnight. So it was. We thought it was extremely immoral. Just the fact that it was a community that really felt like they never had any empowerment in what they'd like to see in their community. The city hadn't put any resources into that community. Even if you go today, you can go and look on the sidewalk, and the sidewalk will say 1946. It's the last time there was any infrastructure invested. Just in the sidewalks alone. There's still cobblestone parts of the sidewalks, which could be a great thing, but I mean, there's not even any accessible, if you're in a wheelchair, there's no ramps on any of these sidewalks. And so I think the idea for, leadership at the time was we're just going to bring in a developer, they're going to tear everything down, and they're going to pay for those sidewalks, they're going to pay for all that stuff anyway. In those 3 months, we engaged the community, we brought everyone together, we visioned what would you like to see. At the same time, Don was working with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And within those 3 months, they actually named us one of the 11 most endangered historic sites in America at that time. Because of that, our story was picked up by AP. We were in the New York Times, the LA Times. The History Channel did a whole thing on us. And we were at the time asking people, write letters to the city council. And it was the largest letter writing campaign that the city council had ever seen. They were receiving letters from the Philippines and all over the world, basically saying, "Hey, we have to honor this history." So, a huge amount of political pressure brought on. The other thing that happened was because the story got picked up, there were developers from San Diego who were involved in the Gaslamp Quarter, the redevelopment of the Gaslamp Quarter, who saw the redevelopment of downtown San Diego using adaptive reuse, smart growth values as actually a way to make a lot of money and more money than just a strip mall. And so they actually approached us and said that, we're developers and, obviously we would like to make money, but we actually believe that preservation and kind of reusing these buildings, rather than just building a strip mall, but really creating kind of a destination place. Strip malls at the time were like weeds in every city. And basically you could find the same stores and, all that kind of stuff. And he said, but you have history here, you have culture, and there's so much you can build upon that. I mean, that's the reason why people go into downtowns, right? And so they actually saw it as a big way to make money, right? But at that time, all Stockton knew about was strip malls, big box stores, all that kind of stuff. No one was doing mixed use in Stockton at the time, or building in empty lots, or any of the things that, hopefully now that the city, understands, urban redevelopment, right? No one knew about that at the time. But because we had folks who had just graduated from college, who just, learned about this stuff, they taught us, they taught the community, and we said, yeah, I think that would be a great place to live if we did do like retail on the first floor and then had a community that could actually access that retail. It would actually be more sustainable. So we had this plan. Of course, we had caveats with the developers, no use of eminent domain, unless there are some absentee landowners in the area who allow certain activities to take place in their buildings. To this day, there's prostitution, there's drug dealing open in the streets. And it's literally 3 blocks away from the police station, right? Which kind of goes to kind of the walls that we have in our community. Kind of what used to be Main Street over here, and kind of that attitude has transferred to the Crosstown Freeway. The building of that, literally a line saying, okay, this is for this people and we're going to maintain it and we're going to take care of it. And you look to the south and you see neglect. And I think people in Stockton, you're just used to that. You just figure that's the way it is. But really, it doesn't have
moral
to be.
Bankruptcy of the Crosstown, south of the Crosstown Freeway.
Yeah.
The city and its leaders, et cetera, were morally bankrupt in that it was just, an underserved, almost abandoned area.
Yeah, and it's the leaders, but also definitely the developers as well. I think part of the marketing of development at the time, both to, in the 1960s, 70s and on, was, these developers would build on land. It used to be farmland. It was all to the north, and so they really changed the perception of upward mobility in Stockton, in that upward mobility in Stockton means you got to live up north. And so a lot of folks who may have grown up and lived life, maybe found the person that they married, the idea of community, kind of formed their idea of community and everything. In order for them to be considered successful in Stockton, you had to move up north. And you had to buy into their property, right? And so one of the things that we always talk about is like, we were kind of misled. Rather than building community, we buy into community. And the people in our community who have, the richest people in our community are the people who created those conditions in Stockton, right? It's affected the mindset of our young people in that I just need to get out of this place, right? So constant, brain drain from South Stockton to even to other communities or just to North Stockton, that this is a place for the poor and, this is a place for upwardly mobile. And although these folks have profited greatly from it, there has been no reinvestment into the communities that they have hurt the most, whether it be, building affordable housing or building, anything new in that area, or just donating right? And I think that's probably the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues that we have, in that as we engage in other communities, and as a nonprofit, we're starting to learn how other nonprofits survive. We don't have the same culture in our community of philanthropy that other folks do, other cities do.
Thank you.
Sure.
One last question.
Sure.
Is there anything about yourself that people don't know about?
Is there anything about myself that people don't know about? I feel like I put it all out there. Well, yeah, I mean, so it's a little crazy. I've been involved. I feel like I'm the Forrest Gump of Stockton to a certain degree, because I've been able to work for the county. I've owned my own small business. I've been on the school board. I got to work in the state senate. I was the director of a new charter school, social justice-based charter school that was created. And now I'm working as the executive director of Little Manila. So I guess that just all sounds like, I'm a youth minister as well. It probably sounds like I can't keep a job, all that kind of stuff. But I think I've been led on a certain journey to kind of be able to understand this larger picture that needs to happen in Stockton. And I think I've been put into places where I can get an understanding of why things are the way they are to a certain degree. I'm extremely grateful for that. It's allowed me to make decisions in my life. When I went from director to this job, it was a really hard decision to make, because I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and basically what it equated to was a $30,000 cut in salary. I think more than anything, being a volunteer youth minister, if you got to stand up in front of a bunch of kids and you got to tell them that you got to live your life in a certain way, and then you're not doing it yourself, or if you can't make those decisions, those tough decisions in that same manner, that you're not going to live a market-based life, but rather you're going to live a love-based life. You got to be able to make those tough decisions and have the faith that you're going to be all right. And I think we definitely need more of that. But maybe that's the thing that people don't know about me, that I am, although I went into this extremely naive, I am intentional about the decisions that I make nowadays, even to the detriment of us, my family in the market world. But can't take the market with you.
That's really good.
Yeah.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to Dillon Delvo, co-founder and executive director of Little Manila Rising, who shared his organization's struggle to preserve 3 historical buildings, as well as develop a temporary museum, and continue to grow their grassroots-based advocacy, education, arts, and cultural services to revitalize the Filipino American community in Stockton. Little Manila Rising, along with other changemakers you have heard from in our series, are working together with Mayor Tubbs to change the long-term economic apartheid of the city of Stockton. Stockton's economic apartheid is a construct whereby South Stockton and downtown is where the economically disadvantaged people are, and North Stockton is where the economically upwardly mobile people are. The challenge is to bring together the entire community to work on the reinvention of Stockton, whereas South Stockton's success is North Stockton's success. Voices of the Community is a labor of love. This documentary series on the city of Stockton's reinvention is a tribute to my mother, Josephine Coster Wiley, who grew up in South Stockton and passed away during the production of the documentary series. My mom was a first-generation Italian immigrant whose family migrated to Stockton and owned a motel on the Old Charter Way, now renamed Martin Luther King Boulevard, in the heart of South Stockton. Mayor Michael Tubbs also grew up in South Stockton with his single mother, Ricole Dixon. Throughout the series, you'll hear voices of community members who are working with Michael Tubbs in both creating new organizations as well as working with fellow community members to reinvent both South Stockton and the greater Stockton community. I want to thank my associate producers, Eric Estrada and Nick McClinton, as well as advising producer, Malcolm Cecil. Please go to georgecoster.com to check out our next episode of From Bankruptcy to Reinvention, the City of Stockton, California documentary series, as well as our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. Please rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast and share the story with your friends. Follow us on Twitter @GeorgeCoster and email us at george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.